The autumn of 1836 descended upon Hampshire with a melancholy that seemed woven into the very fabric of the season, the kind that clung to morning mist and settled deep into the bones of old estates. The carriage that bore Miss Isabella Emberly toward her future rattled over uneven roads, its wheels churning through puddles left by 3 days of unrelenting rain, and with each turn of those wheels, each mile that separated her from the only home she had ever known, she felt herself becoming smaller, more translucent, as though she were fading into the grey landscape that rushed past her window. Her father had not accompanied her, claiming urgent business in London that could not be delayed, though Isabella suspected the truth lay elsewhere, in his inability to meet her eyes, without revealing the shame that had driven him to this desperate measure. The gambling debts, the mortgaged lands, the whispered scandals in drawing rooms where once the Emberly name had been spoken with respect, all of it had culminated in this: a daughter sold to save a son, a marriage arranged with such haste that Isabella had met her intended husband only once, a formal interview in her father's study, where the Duke of Wharncliffe had stood by the window, his back to the light, his face rendered unreadable by shadow. She remembered only the breadth of his shoulders, the coldness in his voice as he inquired about her health and accomplishments with the detachment of a man purchasing livestock, and the way he had departed without once meeting her eyes directly, as though she were too insignificant to warrant his full attention. Now, as the carriage slowed and turned through iron gates that groaned with age and disuse, Isabella pressed her gloved hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she caught her first glimpse of Wharncliffe Manor. The house rose from the landscape like something conjured from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and severe lines, its mullioned windows reflecting the dying light of late afternoon in a way that made them appear both watchful and blind. Ivy climbed the western wall with such abandon that it seemed to be slowly consuming the structure, reclaiming it for the earth from which it had risen, and the formal gardens that should have framed the approach had surrendered to wildness, hedges grown tall and ragged, paths disappearing beneath encroaching moss and fallen leaves. The carriage halted before the main entrance, where shallow steps led to doors of age-darkened oak, and for a moment Isabella remained frozen in her seat, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her kid gloves. A footman, elderly and bent, opened the carriage door, his rheumy eyes regarding her with something that might have been pity before he schooled his features into professional blankness. The household staff assembled to greet her consisted of fewer than a dozen souls, all of them bearing the weariness of servants long accustomed to a master who required little and expected less, and their curtsies and bows held a mechanical quality that spoke of duty performed without joy or expectation. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper, emerged from the shadows of the entrance hall, a woman whose iron-grey hair and ramrod posture suggested she had been carved from the same stone as the house itself, and she regarded Isabella with an assessing gaze that seemed to catalogue every imperfection, every sign of inadequacy, before pronouncing judgment in a tone of crisp civility that allowed for no warmth. "Your Grace, your rooms have been prepared in the south wing," she announced, the title sounding strange and ill-fitting when applied to Isabella, who still thought of herself as merely Miss Emberly, a girl of no particular consequence, whose greatest accomplishment had been a watercolour of her mother's rose garden that now hung, unframed and forgotten, in the morning room of a house that belonged to someone else. The interior of Wharncliffe Manor matched its exterior in cheerless grandeur, high ceilings disappearing into shadow, portraits of stern ancestors lining walls covered in fabric that had once been rich, but now showed its age in faded patches and worn threads, and everywhere the scent of beeswax and lavender could not quite mask the underlying odour of a house too large for its inhabitants, rooms closed off and left to gather dust and memories. Isabella followed Mrs. Hadley up a broad staircase, her hand trailing along a banister polished smooth by generations of hands, and she tried not to think about all those other women who had climbed these stairs, all those other brides who had entered this house with hope or resignation or despair, and she wondered which of those emotions would ultimately claim her. The Duchess's chambers occupied a suite of rooms that must once have been beautiful, their windows overlooking gardens that descended in terraces toward a lake whose surface reflected the leaden sky. And though fires had been lit in both the bedchamber and adjoining sitting room, the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that emanated from the very walls. A maid, young and timid, appeared to help Isabella remove her travelling cloak and bonnet, her fingers fumbling with the fastenings in a way that suggested either inexperience or nervousness. And when Isabella thanked her, the girl's eyes widened as though kindness from her new mistress was unexpected, perhaps even suspect. "His Grace will receive you for dinner at 8, Mrs. Hadley informed her before departing, leaving Isabella alone with her trunks, her uncertainty, and the gathering darkness beyond her windows. She moved through the rooms slowly, cataloguing their contents with the careful attention of someone trying to understand her prison. For that was what this felt like. A cage, gilded with fine furniture and expensive fabrics, but a cage nonetheless. The bed dominated the chamber, its fall, posts carved with such intricate detail that Isabella found herself tracing the pattern with her fingertips, following vines and flowers and strange creatures that seemed to writhe beneath her touch. And she wondered about the craftsmen who had laboured over such work, pouring skill and perhaps love into something that would outlive him by centuries. On the writing desk, she found paper, pens, and ink, all arranged with mathematical precision, and beside them, a single book, its leather binding cracked with age. And when she opened it, she discovered it was a journal, its pages filled with a feminine hand that spoke of daily life within these walls, of walks taken and visitors received and children born, the mundane details of existence recorded with neither complaint nor celebration, merely the steady accumulation of days into weeks into years. The last entry was dated nearly a decade past, and it spoke of nothing more significant than the arrival of bulbs from Holland for the spring garden. But Isabella felt a kinship with this unknown woman, this previous Duchess, who had also found herself within these walls, who had also filled empty hours with small tasks and smaller hopes. As evening approached and the maid returned to help her dress for dinner, Isabella selected a gown of dove-grey silk, its modest cut and lack of ornamentation, reflecting both her circumstances and her temperament, for she had never been one to court attention, had always preferred the edges of rooms to their centres, the quiet observation of others to the performance of self. Her only adornment was a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, its profile rendered in ivory against onyx, a talisman she touched now, as though it might transfer some measure of her mother's strength and grace, qualities Isabella felt certain she herself lacked. The dining room to which she was led could have easily accommodated 50 guests, but tonight only 2 places had been set at one end of the massive table, separated by an expanse of polished mahogany that gleamed in the candlelight like dark water, and the Duke of Wharncliffe stood beside the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel, his posture suggesting both ease and distance, as though he were perfectly comfortable in his isolation and unwilling to surrender it for the sake of courtesy. He turned as she entered, and for the first time, Isabella saw him clearly, unobscured by shadow or haste, and what she saw made her breath catch in a way she did not fully understand. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, his features too strong, too angular, his mouth too severe, but there was something compelling in the architecture of his face, in the intelligence evident in his dark eyes, and the way those eyes now moved over her, cataloguing her as thoroughly as Mrs. Hadley had done, though with what judgment Isabella could not discern. "Your Grace," he said, the words delivered with perfect formality as he executed a bow that acknowledged her title without conceding any warmth. I trust your journey was without incident and your accommodations are satisfactory. Isabella curtsied, her hand steady despite the trembling she felt in her core, and replied with equal formality that all had been provided exactly as needed, the lie smooth on her tongue because what else could she say? That she felt like a ghost in someone else's story. That the weight of this vast house and vaster silence threatened to crush what little sense of self she had managed to maintain. They took their seats, and servants appeared as if summoned by invisible signals, bearing courses that spoke of a kitchen still capable of excellence, despite the general air of neglect that pervaded the rest of the estate. But Isabella found she could manage only small bites, her throat constricting around food that should have been delicious, but tasted of obligation and duty, and all the bitter herbs of a life not chosen. The Duke ate methodically, his attention seemingly focused on his plate, though Isabella sensed that he was aware of her every movement, every breath, with a consciousness that felt almost oppressive in its intensity, and she wondered what he saw when he looked at her, whether he found her as disappointing as she suspected, whether he regretted the bargain that had brought her here. It was he who finally broke the silence that had stretched between them like a physical barrier, his voice low and carefully modulated when he said, "I understand this arrangement is not what you would have chosen for yourself, and for that I offer my regret, though not my apology, as necessity rarely concerns itself with our preferences." Isabella set down her fork with deliberate care and forced herself to meet his gaze, to look directly into those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets she could not begin to fathom, and she replied, "We are both bound by duties not of our own making, Your Grace, and I shall endeavour to fulfil mine with whatever grace I can muster, though I confess I am uncertain what precisely those duties entail." Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to identify, before his expression settled once more into that mask of controlled indifference, and he said, "You need not concern yourself with anything beyond maintaining the household and representing the family with appropriate dignity. At such social functions as cannot be avoided, I require no more from you than that, and as for other matters—" He paused, and Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks as she understood what he meant. "We shall maintain separate establishments and trouble each other as little as possible." The words should have brought relief, should have eased the anxiety that had knotted itself around her heart, but instead, Isabella felt something twist inside her, a sensation she could not name, but that tasted of rejection and insignificance, as though she had been judged and found so thoroughly wanting that even the basic requirements of marriage were to be denied her. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and returned her attention to the food she could not eat while the candles burned lower, and the silence resumed its dominion over the vast room and the two people who occupied such a small portion of it. When the interminable meal finally concluded, the Duke rose and informed her that he would be occupied with estate business for the remainder of the evening, that she should feel free to explore the house and grounds as she wished, and that he bid her good night with all the warmth of a landlord addressing a tenant before he departed through one of the several doors that opened off the dining room, leaving Isabella alone with the servants who moved like shadows to clear the table. She retreated to her chambers, where the fire had been built up and the bed turned down, and she stood at the window looking out at darkness so complete it seemed the world ended at the edge of the terrace, and she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving her father's house, to weep, not with dramatic abandon, but with the quiet, despairing tears of someone who has just realized the full measure of her isolation. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of running through endless corridors, searching for something she could not name, opening door after door to find only empty rooms, and somewhere in the distance, a voice calling her name, though whether in warning or welcome she could never quite determine. The morning arrived with reluctant light, the kind that seemed to seep rather than shine through the heavy curtains, and Isabella woke disoriented, uncertain for a moment where she was before memory returned with the weight of stone. She rose and dressed with the maid's assistance, selecting a simple morning gown of pale green muslin that had been one of her favourites at home, though now it seemed to belong to a different girl entirely, someone younger and more hopeful than the woman who regarded herself in the looking-glass with critical eyes that found only inadequacy. Breakfast was laid out in a small dining room that opened onto the terrace, and Isabella discovered she was to take the meal alone, the Duke having already ridden out to inspect the tenants' cottages, or so Mrs. Hadley informed her, with that same brisk efficiency that discouraged questions or conversation. After forcing herself to consume toast and tea, Isabella decided to accept the Duke's suggestion that she explore the house, though she suspected his motive had been less about encouraging her comfort and more about keeping her occupied and out of his way. She wandered through the main floor first, discovering a music room where a pianoforte sat silent beneath a Holland cover, its keys untouched for so long that Isabella wondered if anyone in this house even remembered the sound of music, and beside it a harp, also covered, its strings likely gone slack with age and neglect. The library proved more promising, its walls lined floor to ceiling with volumes that spoke of generations of collectors, some scholarly, some merely acquisitive, and Isabella ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles that ranged from agricultural treatises to poetry, from natural philosophy to novels whose presence on these serious shelves suggested that perhaps not all the previous occupants of this house had been as sombre as the current one. She selected a volume of Wordsworth and settled into a chair by the window, intending to lose herself in verse, but found her attention wandering to the view beyond the glass, where the overgrown gardens beckoned with their wild beauty, and after several minutes of attempting and failing to focus on the page before her, she set the book aside and ventured outside. The terrace gave way to a broad lawn that descended in levels, connected by stone steps worn smooth and slightly concave from centuries of footfalls, and at each level there were remnants of what must once have been magnificent formal plantings, parterres whose geometric precision had been softened and obscured by rampant growth, roses that had reverted to their wild forms and now scrambled over walls and up trees with thorny abandon, and statuary whose classical forms emerged from shrouds of ivy like drowning figures reaching toward air. Isabella followed a path that seemed to remember its purpose, even though its edges had blurred and its surface had been invaded by moss and small flowers that crushed beneath her shoes, releasing scents of mint and thyme, and she felt something loosen in her chest, some small portion of the tightness that had taken up residence there beginning to ease as she moved through this space, where neglect had paradoxically created a kind of beauty that perfect maintenance might have precluded. At the farthest reach of the garden, where the cultivated land gave way to natural woodland, Isabella discovered a structure she had not noticed from the house, a small pavilion or folly constructed in the classical style, its columns supporting a domed roof, its interior furnished with stone benches and a floor of intricate mosaic that time and weather had damaged but not destroyed. She stepped inside, grateful for the shade despite the coolness of the day, and as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, she noticed that someone had been here recently, for on one of the benches lay a book, its pages held open by a smooth river stone, and beside it a riding crop and gloves, clearly placed there by someone who intended to return. Isabella knew she should leave, should not intrude upon what was obviously a private retreat, but curiosity drew her forward, and she glanced at the open book, finding it to be a volume of poetry, the same poet she had attempted to read in the library, and her eyes fell upon a passage that had been marked with a faint line in pencil, words that spoke of solitude and memory and the weight of years, and she wondered whether the Duke had made that mark, whether these words resonated with something in him, whether beneath his cold exterior there existed a man capable of being moved by beauty and truth. A sound behind her made Isabella turn sharply, her heart leaping into her throat, and there in the entrance to the pavilion stood the Duke himself, his dark coat and boots suggesting he had just returned from his ride, and his expression as he regarded her was unreadable, though Isabella felt certain she had transgressed some unspoken boundary. "Your Grace, I apologize," she began, her words tumbling over themselves in her haste to explain. "I did not mean to intrude. I was merely exploring the gardens and discovered this place. I did not realize it was occupied or private. I shall leave at once." She moved toward the entrance, intending to hurry past him, but he raised one hand in a gesture that was not quite commanding, but nonetheless stopped her in her tracks, and he said, "You need not apologize for walking your own gardens. Your Grace." The title carrying a subtle emphasis that reminded her of her position here, however unwelcome she might feel. "And as for this place, it is merely where I come occasionally to escape the demands of the house and the estate, but I have no exclusive claim to it." Isabella nodded, uncertain whether this was invitation or dismissal, and she watched as he entered the pavilion and retrieved his belongings. And as he bent to collect the book, she said, without quite knowing why, "I was reading Wordsworth myself this morning, in the library, though I confess I found it difficult to concentrate. My mind was elsewhere." The Duke straightened slowly, the book now in his hand, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but somehow held her gaze captive, and he said, "Your mind was perhaps occupied with thoughts of your family, of the life you have left behind. It is natural to grieve such losses even when the change comes with certain advantages." There was something in his tone, some undercurrent she could not identify, that suggested his words carried meanings beyond their surface. And Isabella found herself replying with more honesty than she had intended. "I confess, Your Grace, that I am uncertain what advantages you refer to, as I seem to have traded one form of invisibility for another. At least in my father's house, I understood my place and purpose, whereas here I am adrift, a title without substance, a duchess without duties or direction." She regretted the words the moment they left her lips, for they revealed too much, exposed the raw wound of her displacement, and she expected him to respond with coldness or anger, to remind her of her good fortune in having secured such a marriage. But instead, his expression shifted, something almost like pain crossing his features before being schooled away, and he said, very quietly, "You were never invisible, Isabella." The use of her given name, spoken with such unexpected gentleness, shocked her more than any rebuke could have done, and she stared at him, trying to reconcile this man who stood before her now with the cold stranger who had interviewed her in her father's study, who had eaten dinner across an impossible distance, who had dismissed her to separate chambers without a second glance. "How can you say such a thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "when you look at me as though I am a necessary burden, when you arrange our lives to ensure we need never occupy the same space, when you make it abundantly clear that my presence here is tolerated rather than desired." The Duke's jaw tightened, and he turned away from her, moving to stand at the edge of the pavilion, where he could look out over the wild gardens and the lake beyond, and when he spoke, his words seemed dragged from somewhere deep and carefully guarded. "I say it because it is true, because you have never been invisible to me, not for a single moment in all the years I have known you." Isabella's breath caught, confusion flooding through her, because his words made no sense. They had met only once before their wedding, that brief interview in her father's study. How could he claim to have known her for years, unless, she searched her memory, trying to recall if perhaps they had been introduced at some function she had forgotten, some ball or assembly where she had been one among many, and he had been the kind of man whose attention would never have fallen on someone like her. "I do not understand," she said. "We met only once before we married. How can you claim to have known me?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, so long that Isabella thought perhaps he would not answer, that he would collect his things, and leave her standing in confusion. But then he turned back to her, and there was something raw in his expression, something that looked almost like anguish, and he said, "We met more than once, Isabella. Though I cannot fault you for failing to remember. You were a child then, and I, I was already learning to be invisible myself, to be the title rather than the man, and so you looked through me as everyone did, seeing only the Duke of Wharncliffe, not Adrian Thornton, the boy who watched you feed the swans in the park and thought he had never seen anyone move with such unconscious grace, the youth who stood at the edge of ballrooms and observed you sitting with the wallflowers, speaking to them with kindness while others ignored them, the man who has carried the image of you for more than a decade and who, when circumstances provided an opportunity to claim what he had never dared hope for, seized it with the desperation of someone who knows he is taking what he has not earned. The words fell into the space between them like stones, into still water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching everything, changing everything. And Isabella found she could not speak, could not move, could barely breathe as she tried to assemble this new information into a coherent picture, tried to reconcile the cold, distant man of the past 2 days with someone who claimed to have harbored feelings for her since childhood, someone who had, by his own admission, manipulated circumstances to bring about their marriage. "I do not," she began, then stopped, started again. "You cannot expect me to believe," but again she faltered, because looking at him now, at the tension in his shoulders and the vulnerability in his eyes, she realized he was telling the truth, or at least what he believed to be the truth. And she did not know what to do with that knowledge, how to hold it, where to place it in the careful architecture of understanding she had been constructing. "Why did you not?" She searched for words. "If you felt such things, why did you never approach me properly? Why resort to arranging a marriage through my father's debts? Why not court me as other men courted other women, with honesty and openness?" "Because," the Duke said, his voice rough with something that might have been self-contempt, "I am a coward, because I could not bear the thought of offering myself honestly and being refused, of confirming what I have always known, that I am not the kind of man who inspires love or even affection, that my only value lies in my title and fortune. And so, when your father's situation became known to me, when I learned of his desperation and your impending ruin, I told myself I was acting altruistically, saving your family from disgrace, while simultaneously fulfilling my duty to marry and produce an heir. But the truth, which I am only now admitting to myself as well as to you, is that I acted out of pure selfishness. I took advantage of your vulnerability to possess what I have wanted for years, knowing full well that you would never have chosen me of your own free will." Isabella sank onto one of the stone benches, her legs suddenly unable to support her, and she pressed her hands against her face, trying to order her thoughts, trying to understand, not just what he had told her, but what it meant, what she was supposed to do with this confession, how she was supposed to feel about being desired in secret while being treated with coldness, about being trapped in a marriage that he claimed was motivated by decade-old longing, but that felt in practice like indifferent duty. She lowered her hands and looked up at him, this stranger who claimed to have known her all her life, and she said, "If what you say is true, if you have truly felt such things for so long, then why have you been so cold since my arrival? Why separate chambers and separate lives? Why the determination to keep distance between us when you have engineered circumstances to bring me here?" The Duke moved toward her slowly, cautiously, as though approaching something wild that might bolt, and he knelt before her so that their faces were level, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples, the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some long-ago injury. And he said, "Because having you here, within these walls, is both more wonderful and more terrible than I imagined, because every moment in your presence is torture when I know you are here only because you had no choice, that you look at me without recognition or warmth, that I have become the very thing I despised, a man who takes rather than earns. And I thought, foolishly perhaps, that I could protect both of us by maintaining distance, by not inflicting my unwanted feelings upon you, by giving you the freedom of your own space and your own life, even if we must share a name and a house. Isabella found herself looking into his eyes, truly looking for perhaps the first time, and what she saw there was not the cold indifference she had perceived before, but rather something carefully restrained, deliberately suppressed, a longing so intense it seemed to radiate from him like heat, and she realized that what she had interpreted as rejection had in fact been protection. His attempt to shield her from the weight of his feelings, to give her room to breathe in a situation she had not chosen. "I do not know what to feel," she admitted, her honesty matching his. "I do not know how to reconcile the man you were yesterday with the man you are revealing yourself to be today. I do not know whether to be angry at the deception or moved by the confession. I only know that nothing is what I thought it was, and I am more lost now than I was when I arrived." The Duke rose, moving back to give her space, and he said, "I do not expect you to feel anything but confusion and perhaps anger. I have no right to expect anything from you, but I wanted you to know the truth, however uncomfortable it makes both of us, because I could not bear the weight of the deception any longer, and because you deserve to understand that your presence here, however it came about, is not a burden I tolerate, but a gift I do not deserve." He collected his book and gloves and riding crop, and he moved toward the entrance of the pavilion, and before he departed, he turned back once more and said, "The house and grounds are yours to command, Isabella. I shall keep to my own spaces and leave you to find whatever peace you can here. And please know that if there is anything you need or want, you have only to ask. I may not be able to give you freedom from this marriage, but I can at least ensure you have freedom within it." Then he was gone, striding back toward the house with quick steps that suggested flight, rather than mere departure, and Isabella remained on the stone bench, surrounded by columns and silence, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had learned, trying to understand how the ground beneath her had shifted so completely in the span of a single conversation, and wondering whether what she felt rising in her chest was the beginning of something entirely unexpected or merely the echo of her own desperate longing for this place, this marriage, this life to mean something more than duty and despair. The weeks that followed the revelation in the pavilion unfolded with a strange new awareness that colored every interaction, every shared space, every moment when Isabella caught sight of the Duke in his study, or riding across the park, or standing at a window, looking out at the rain that fell with such persistence it seemed the sky had forgotten how to withhold its tears. She found herself watching him when he was unaware of her observation, trying to reconcile the cold stranger of those first days with the man who claimed to have carried her image for more than a decade, and sometimes, in unguarded moments, she would catch him watching her, with an expression that held such naked longing, it made her breath catch before he noticed her noticing, and his features would rearrange themselves into polite neutrality. Isabella began to test the boundaries of the freedom he had promised her, making small changes to the household routines, requesting that certain rooms be opened and aired, that the pianoforte be tuned, that the gardens be trimmed back just enough to reveal their bones without destroying their wild beauty, and to each request he assented without question, his only response a nod or a brief note left on her writing desk, expressing his approval and his pleasure that she was making the house her own. She discovered, quite by accident, a portrait gallery on the third floor, a long room lit by dormer windows, where generations of his family looked down from gilt frames with varying degrees of severity and kindness, and she walked slowly along the rows, studying faces and reading the small brass plaques that identified each subject, and near the end of the gallery she found a portrait that stopped her in her tracks, a young woman of perhaps 20 painted in the style of 40 years prior, wearing a gown of rose silk and an expression of gentle melancholy, and though Isabella could not say why, something in the woman's face seemed familiar, seemed to echo something she saw in her own mirror. "She was my mother," a voice said behind her, and Isabella turned to find the Duke standing at the entrance to the gallery, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "She died when I was 8, and my father never recovered from the loss. He retreated into himself and into his duties, leaving me in the care of tutors and servants who were kind enough but who could not fill the void she left. Isabella looked back at the portrait, understanding now why the face had seemed familiar, for she could see traces of the Duke in the set of the woman's eyes and the shape of her mouth, and she said, "She was beautiful, and she looks kind. I am sorry you lost her so young." The Duke moved into the room, walking slowly until he stood beside Isabella, both of them now, regarding the portrait together, and he said, "She was the only person who ever saw me, truly saw me rather than the air or the title, and after she died, I learned to hide, to become what was expected, rather than risk revealing what was real and having it dismissed or destroyed. And so I became proficient at being the Duke, while burying Adrian so deep I sometimes forgot he existed at all." Isabella turned to look at him, this man who was slowly revealing himself to her in fragments, and she asked, "What made you remember? What made you decide to risk revealing yourself again?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the portrait, and then he said, "You did, because watching you these past weeks, seeing you move through this house with grace and quiet determination, bringing light and life back to spaces that have been dark and dead for years, I realized that I could not continue the charade, that I was becoming as much of a ghost as this place had been, and I thought, perhaps foolishly, that if I could not have your love, I could at least have your knowledge, your understanding that someone had seen you too, had recognized your worth, even if he was too much of a coward to claim it honestly." The vulnerability in his words, the rawness of the admission, touched something in Isabella. Some place that had been carefully protected for so long she had forgotten it was there, and she found herself reaching out, her hand hovering near his sleeve, not quite touching, but close enough that he could surely feel the proximity, and she said, "I am trying to understand you, Adrian, trying to reconcile all the different pieces into something coherent, and I confess I am not certain what I feel beyond confusion and a strange kind of curiosity, but I do not think you are a coward. A coward would never have admitted what you admitted in the pavilion. A coward would have maintained the deception indefinitely." He turned his head to look at her, and in the dim light of the gallery, his eyes seemed darker, more fathomless, and he said, "You called me Adrian," and Isabella realized that she had, that his given name had slipped from her lips without conscious thought, feeling more natural than the formal title, despite the brevity of their acquaintance. And she smiled, a small uncertain thing, and replied, "Is that not your name? Should I not use it when we are private?" Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a warming, like ice beginning to thaw under unexpected sun, and he said, "You may call me whatever you wish, Isabella, but hearing you say my name, it is a gift I did not know I wanted until this moment." They stood in silence for a time, the portraits of his ancestors bearing witness to this small intimacy, this incremental movement towards something that might eventually become understanding if not affection, and Isabella found herself wondering about all those other Thornton women who had hung in this gallery, whether they had married for love or duty, whether they had found happiness within these walls or merely endurance, whether they had managed to truly see the men they married or had lived alongside strangers for decades. A sound from below broke the spell, servants moving through the house, the distant clang of a bell announcing some meal or visitor, and the Duke, Adrian, stepped back, creating space between them once more, and he said, "I have taken enough of your time. I am sure you have other pursuits, but I wanted you to know the gallery is yours to visit as often as you like, and if you would care to know the stories behind any of these faces, I would be happy to share what I know. My mother used to tell me tales about each of them, separating fact from family legend, and I find I remember more than I realized." Isabella nodded, filing away this invitation for future use, and she watched as he moved toward the door, his departure always seeming to carry a quality of reluctance, as though he had to force himself to leave her presence. And just before he crossed the threshold, she called out, "Adrian," and he stopped, turned, waited, and she said, "Thank you for sharing her with me, for sharing yourself. I know it cannot be easy." He inclined his head, a gesture that held more warmth than any words could have conveyed, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Isabella was left alone with the portraits and the growing realization that she was beginning to care about this strange, damaged man who had orchestrated their marriage out of longing and fear. And she did not know whether that caring would save them both or destroy what little peace they had managed to construct. The days continued their progression, autumn deepening into the kind of richness that comes just before decay, the trees blazing with colour that would soon fall and leave them bare, and Isabella established routines that gave shape to her time, mornings in the garden or the library, afternoons managing household accounts, and meeting with Mrs. Hadley about supplies and repairs, evenings playing the newly tuned pianoforte, her fingers relearning melodies she had not attempted in months. And sometimes, though not always, she would sense rather than see Adrian standing just outside the music room, listening but not intruding, present but invisible. One afternoon when the weather had turned particularly foul, rain lashing the windows with unusual violence, Isabella was reviewing the household accounts when she discovered something that made her frown, an expenditure listed as tenant repairs, but showing an amount far in excess of what such work should cost, and when she cross-referenced it with earlier entries, she found a pattern. Money disappearing into vague categories that should not have required such substantial sums, and she realized with growing certainty that someone was embezzling from the estate, systematically and over considerable time. She knew she should inform Adrian that this was precisely the sort of matter that required his attention, but she hesitated, uncertain whether she had the right to involve herself in estate business, whether he would welcome her observation or resent her intrusion, but ultimately her sense of duty overcame her uncertainty, and she went in search of him, finding him in his study surrounded by papers and ledgers of his own, his hair slightly dishevelled, as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. "Your Grace," she began, then corrected herself. "Adrian, I apologize for the interruption, but I have discovered something in the household accounts that I believe requires your immediate attention." He looked up, and whatever weariness had been in his expression fled at the sight of her, replaced by something eager, almost hungry, though he quickly schooled his features into polite inquiry and said, "Please sit, tell me what you have found." Isabella settled into the chair opposite his desk and spread out the papers she had brought, walking him through what she had discovered, pointing out the inconsistencies and the pattern they revealed. And as she spoke, she watched his expression shift from polite interest to genuine concern, and finally to anger, though she sensed the anger was not directed at her, but at the betrayal itself, and at his own failure to notice it sooner. "This is excellent work, Isabella," he said when she had finished, "far more thorough than my own review, which clearly missed what you have found. Do you have suspicions as to who might be responsible?" She did, though she had not wanted to voice them without more evidence, but she told him of her observations, of a certain servant whose lifestyle seemed to exceed his position, whose relatives had recently come into unexplained prosperity, and Adrian listened with close attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a mind quick to grasp complexities and implications. And when she had finished, he sat back in his chair and regarded her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are formidable," he said finally, a statement that held no mockery or condescension, but rather genuine admiration. "I thought I was providing you a safe haven when I brought you here. I did not realize I was gaining a partner who would prove herself more capable and observant than I am myself." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, unused to being acknowledged for her abilities, rather than merely her accomplishments in needlework or watercolours, and she said, "I merely applied the same attention to detail that I would have given to my father's accounts, had he allowed me such access. Numbers tell stories if one knows how to listen to them, and these numbers were speaking quite loudly about deception and theft." Adrian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features into something warmer, more approachable, and he said, "Then you must help me unravel this particular story, Isabella, for I confess I am better with abstract principles than practical details, and I would welcome your assistance in both discovering the full extent of the theft and determining how best to address it." They spent the remainder of the afternoon together, heads bent over ledgers and receipts, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same document, and Isabella found herself intensely aware of his proximity, of the scent of ink and sandalwood that seemed to cling to him, of the way his brow furrowed in concentration and the small sound he made when he discovered something particularly damning, and she realized with a start that she was enjoying herself, that this collaboration felt natural and right in a way that nothing else in her life had felt for longer than she could remember. As evening approached and servants came to light the lamps, Adrian looked up and seemed surprised to find that hours had passed, and he said, "I have kept you far too long. You must be exhausted." But Isabella shook her head and replied, "I am energized. Actually, it is satisfying to feel useful, to know that I can contribute something beyond managing menus and arranging flowers." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though looking for something specific, and then he said, "You have never been merely decorative, Isabella. I wish you could see yourself as I see you, as someone of genuine substance and worth, someone who has improved everything she has touched since arriving here." The intensity of his gaze and the fervor of his words created a tension in the room, a charge in the air that felt like the moment before lightning strikes, and Isabella found she could not look away, could not retreat behind polite deflection, and she said, with an honesty that surprised her, "I am beginning to see that perhaps I judged you too harshly at first, that perhaps there is more depth to you, to this place, to what we might build here together, than I allowed myself to hope for." Adrian stood slowly, moving around the desk until he stood before her, and he extended his hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand, and when she placed her hand in his, the contact sent a shock through her entire being. The warmth of his skin against hers, even through the barrier of her glove feeling like the first genuine touch they had shared, and he drew her to her feet, so that they stood close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his dark eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that when he spoke, his breath stirred the loose tendrils of hair at her temple. "I want to give you time," he said, his voice low and rough with restrained emotion. "Time to know me, to decide for yourself whether what I feel, what I have felt for years, might somehow be answered in you. I will not press you or demand anything beyond what you are willing to freely give, but I hope, with a desperation that frightens me, that someday you might look at me and see not just the Duke who arranged your marriage, but Adrian, the man who has loved you since he was barely more than a boy himself." Isabella's breath caught at the word "loved," spoken aloud for the first time, given voice and weight and undeniable reality, and she found herself swaying forward slightly, drawn by something she could not name but could not resist, and she whispered, "I do not know what I feel, Adrian. I only know that I am no longer certain I want the distance you promised, no longer certain that separate lives serve either of us well." His free hand rose, hovering near her cheek, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, and he said, "Then we shall find our way together, slowly, at whatever pace you need, but together rather than apart, if that is truly what you want." "It is," she said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "It is what I want." The moment stretched between them, taut and trembling with possibility, and Isabella thought he might kiss her, thought she might want him to, but instead, he raised the hand he held and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the gesture chivalrous and restrained, but carrying more intimacy than any passionate embrace might have done. And when he released her and stepped back, the loss of contact felt like a physical ache. "Forgive me," he said. "I am trying to be honorable, to give you the choice I never gave you before, even when what I want most is to pull you into my arms and never let go." Isabella surprised herself by smiling, a genuine expression of warmth and something that might have been the beginning of affection, and she said, "Your restraint is noted and appreciated, even if it is also somewhat frustrating." His answering laugh, spontaneous and delighted, seemed to surprise him as much as her words had, and he said, "I shall endeavour to be exactly as frustrating as you require, Your Grace." And with that he bowed, a gesture that held respect and promise in equal measure, and withdrew from his study, leaving Isabella alone with the ledgers and the lamps and the growing understanding that she was falling, slowly but inexorably, into something that might eventually be called love. The scandal broke 3 days later, with the appearance at their door of a constable and 2 magistrates bearing news that would test the fragile accord Isabella and Adrian had begun to build. For the embezzlement they had uncovered proved to be merely one thread in a much larger web of criminal activity, and the servant responsible had not acted alone but in concert with a London syndicate that targeted estates throughout the county, infiltrating households and slowly bleeding them of resources while maintaining perfect facades of loyalty and service. Adrian's anger, when the full extent of the scheme became clear, was cold and controlled, a fury all the more terrible for its restraint, and Isabella watched him navigate the subsequent investigation with a competence and authority she had not fully appreciated before, seeing in him not merely a man of title, but a man of genuine capability, someone who understood both justice and mercy, who could be firm without being cruel, decisive without being rash. The matter required his testimony in London, meetings with solicitors and barristers, appearances before magistrates who needed to understand the scope of the fraud, and he asked Isabella diffidently whether she would accompany him, whether she would be willing to leave the relative safety of Wharncliffe Manor for the bustling uncertainty of town, and she agreed without hesitation, recognizing in his request not a demand but an invitation, an acknowledgement that he wanted her presence, not because protocol required it, but because he simply wanted her near. The journey to London proved revelatory in unexpected ways, for the enforced proximity of the carriage, the hours spent side by side with nothing to do but talk or read, or watch the countryside roll past, created an intimacy that the vast spaces of the manor had precluded, and Isabella found herself sharing stories of her childhood, her mother's death, her father's gradual withdrawal into gambling and drink, her own feelings of inadequacy and invisibility, and Adrian listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed how closely he had attended to every word, and in return he shared his own history, the loneliness of his childhood after his mother's death, the crushing weight of expectations and duty, the way he had learned to perform the role of Duke while keeping his true self locked away where it could not be judged or rejected. They stayed in his London townhouse, an elegant but austere establishment in Mayfair that clearly saw little use, its rooms kept under Holland covers and its staff reduced to a skeleton crew. And Isabella found herself assigned to the Duchess's chambers, a suite that connected through a shared dressing room to the Duke's own apartments, the proximity both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. On the 3rd night of their stay, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and testimonies, Isabella stood at her window, looking out at the London streets below, watching carriages pass and pedestrians hurry about their business, and she heard the soft knock at the connecting door that she had left deliberately unlocked, and when she called permission to enter, Adrian appeared in his shirt-sleeves and waistcoat, his cravat removed and his dark hair tousled from running his hands through it, and he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than she had seen him since that day in the pavilion when he had first confessed his long-held feelings. "I could not sleep," he said by way of explanation, "and I found myself hoping you might still be awake, that you might tolerate my company for a while. Though if you prefer solitude, I shall return to my own chambers without offence." Isabella smiled and gestured to the pair of chairs arranged before the fireplace, where a low fire still burned against the autumn chill, and she said, "I could not sleep either. My mind is too full of everything we learned today, too disturbed by the casual cruelty of people who would prey upon others without remorse or conscience. They settled into the chairs, and for a time they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fires dance, and then Adrian said, "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how you felt invisible in your father's house, and I wanted to tell you that I understand that feeling more deeply than you might realize. For I too spent years being unseen, overlooked in favor of the title I carried, and it is a special kind of loneliness to be surrounded by people who cannot or will not see you as you actually are." Isabella turned to look at him, this man who had seemed so confident and self-assured at first, but who was revealing himself to be as wounded and uncertain as she was herself, and she said, "Is that why you noticed me? Because you recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who existed on the periphery of rooms and lives?" "Perhaps," he admitted, "or perhaps I simply saw you, truly saw you, the way no one had ever seen me, and I recognized something precious that was being wasted, hidden, overlooked, and I wanted, desperately wanted, to be the one who could make you visible, who could reflect back to you your own worth and beauty." His words settled over her like a warm cloak, and Isabella found herself rising from her chair and crossing the small distance to his, and she knelt beside him, her hands resting lightly on the arm of his chair, and she said, "You have made me visible, Adrian, these past weeks, in ways I am only beginning to understand. You have given me purpose and partnership and the beginning of something I dare not name for fear of jinxing it. But I want you to know that I see you too, that I am beginning to understand what you meant when you said you had buried Adrian beneath the Duke. And I want to know him, want to know you, all of you, not just the careful parts you show the world, but the broken and wounded and uncertain parts as well." Adrian's hand rose to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with such tenderness that Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes, and he said, "I am afraid, Isabella, afraid that if you truly see all of me you will find me wanting, that the reality of Adrian Thornton will disappoint you in ways the Duke of Wharncliffe never could, because he is merely a role I play, while Adrian is who I actually am, and he is far less impressive, far more damaged and doubtful than anyone suspects." Isabella leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his, and she whispered, "Then let me see him. Let me judge for myself. Do not protect me from your humanity by offering only your perfection, because I do not want perfection. Adrian, I want truth. I want the man who reads poetry in hidden pavilions, and who carries his mother's memory like a talisman, and who has somehow found it in himself to love an overlooked girl with a patience that humbles me." The kiss, when it finally came, was not passionate or desperate, but tender, questioning, a gentle exploration that asked permission with every movement, and Isabella answered by threading her fingers through his hair and pulling him closer, and what began as hesitant became certain. What started as careful became necessary, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly shocked by the intensity of feeling that had flared between them, Adrian rested his forehead against hers and said, "I want to do this properly, Isabella. I want to court you as I should have done from the beginning. I want to earn what I took, and I want you to have no doubt that what I feel is real and lasting and worthy of your trust." Isabella smiled against his lips and murmured, "You are courting me. We simply began with the marriage instead of ending with it, and I rather think that gives us an advantage, for we need not pretend or perform. We can simply be ourselves with each other, learning and growing and discovering who we are when we are together." They spent the remainder of the night in those chairs by the fire, talking and occasionally kissing, sharing confidences and dreams and fears, and when dawn began to lighten the windows, Adrian reluctantly returned to his own chambers, but not before pressing one more kiss to Isabella's palm, and promising that when this business with the magistrates was concluded, when they returned to Wharncliffe Manor, they would begin again, properly this time, with honesty and openness, and the slow, careful building of something that might last beyond duty or obligation. The business in London was resolved within the fortnight, the criminals apprehended and charged, the stolen funds recovered in large part, and restitution arranged for the estates that had been defrauded. And throughout it all, Isabella remained at Adrian's side, her presence providing an anchor and comfort he had not realized he needed, and more than once she saw him glance in her direction during some particularly tedious meeting or frustrating interview, and the small smile that would curve his lips when their eyes met told her that her presence mattered, that she was seen and valued, not for what she could do, but simply for being herself. They departed London on a crisp autumn morning, the city releasing them back to the countryside with something that felt like reluctance, and as the carriage rolled through streets giving way to lanes giving way to open country, Isabella sat beside Adrian, rather than opposite, their hands clasped on the seat between them, and she felt something settle in her chest, a peace she had not known she was seeking, a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with destination and everything to do with the man whose shoulder she leaned against as the miles passed beneath their wheels. Wharncliffe Manor welcomed them with the warmth of late afternoon sun, gilding its stones and making the overgrown gardens glow with amber light, and Isabella realized with a start that she was happy to return, that somewhere in the past weeks this place had stopped being a prison and had become instead a sanctuary, a space where she could be fully herself without pretense or performance, where she was known and valued and, she dared to think it, perhaps even beginning to be loved. That evening they dined together, not at opposite ends of a vast table, but side by side in the smaller dining room. And afterwards, Adrian suggested they walk in the garden despite the growing chill, and Isabella agreed, fetching a shawl, while he collected a lantern to light their way. They wandered the paths she had first explored alone, but now Adrian pointed out features she had missed, telling her the history of certain plantings, explaining which sections had been his mother's favourites, sharing plans he had never implemented for restoring the gardens to their former glory. And Isabella found herself offering suggestions, imagining how the space might be transformed, and their voices wove together in the gathering darkness like music, like a conversation that had no end, because both parties wanted it to continue indefinitely. They arrived at the pavilion, where he had first confessed his feelings, and Adrian set the lantern on one of the stone benches, its light creating a small circle of warmth in the darkness, and he turned to Isabella and said, "I brought you here deliberately, because this is where I first dared to speak truth, and I want to continue that honesty now. I want to tell you that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life, that you have exceeded every hope and dream I harbored during all those years of watching you from a distance, and that I am no longer content with the half-life I proposed when you first arrived. I want a true marriage, Isabella. In every sense, I want to share not just a house but a life, not just a name but a future. And I want it only if you want it too, only if I have earned the right through these weeks of courtship conducted backwards and inside out." Isabella felt tears gather in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or uncertainty, but rather of joy, of relief, of gratitude for this strange and unexpected gift she had been given, and she said, "You have earned it, Adrian, not through any single grand gesture, but through 1,000 small kindnesses, through seeing me and valuing me, and treating me as a partner rather than a possession. And yes, I want what you want. I want to build a life with you. I want to know you, and be known by you. I want to share your burdens and your joys. I want everything that marriage should be, and that I feared ours would never become." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was something precious and fragile, and he said against her hair, "I will spend the rest of my life making certain you will never regret giving me this chance, making certain you know every day that you are seen and valued and cherished beyond measure." Isabella lifted her face to his, her hands framing his beloved features, and she whispered, "Then take me home, Adrian, take me to our chambers, and let us begin this marriage properly at last. For I am tired of waiting, tired of restraint. I want to know you completely, to belong to you, and have you belong to me in turn. The walk back to the house was swift despite the darkness, and they climbed the stairs hand in hand, their pulses racing with anticipation and nerves and desire. And when they reached the landing, where their chambers lay, Adrian paused and said, "Are you certain, Isabella? We need not rush. I can wait as long as you need." But Isabella shook her head and pulled him toward her door, saying, "I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything. You have already waited years. We have both waited long enough." What passed between them that night was tender and passionate by turns, a discovery of bodies and souls, a claiming and a surrender that left them both breathless and transformed. And in the aftermath, as they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender and their own mingled scent, Adrian traced patterns on Isabella's bare shoulder and said, "I loved you as a stranger, an image, an idea, but I love you now as a woman, as my wife, as the person you actually are, and it is so much better than anything I imagined." Isabella turned in his arms so she could see his face, could read the truth in his eyes, and she said, "I did not expect to love you. I came here resigned to duty and determined merely to survive. But you have given me something to live for, someone to live with, and I find that I do love you, Adrian. Perhaps not with the years of longing you brought to this marriage, but with a depth that surprises me, a certainty that this is right, that we are right together." They slept eventually, wrapped in each other and in the peace of having finally, truly found each other. And when morning came, it brought not the awkwardness Isabella had half feared, but rather a comfortable intimacy, a easiness of being together that suggested they had always been thus, that all the weeks of distance and formality had been the aberration, and this closeness, the natural state they had been seeking all along. 10 years passed like water, flowing swift in some seasons and slow in others, but always moving forward, carrying Adrian and Isabella through joys and sorrows, triumphs and trials, the ordinary and extraordinary moments that comprise a life fully lived. The gardens at Wharncliffe Manor were restored to glory and beyond. Isabella's vision combined with Adrian's resources, creating something that drew visitors from across the county, not merely to admire the beauty of the plantings, but to witness the evident love that had shaped them. For everyone who walked those paths could sense that they had been designed not for display, but for joy, spaces meant to be inhabited and cherished rather than merely observed. The house itself had been transformed as well. Rooms long closed were opened and filled with light and purpose. The pianoforte was played daily, often with Adrian turning pages for Isabella, or attempting, with laughable results that made them both dissolve into laughter, to play duets despite his admitted lack of musical talent. And the portrait gallery had been extended to include new faces, Isabella's own likeness hanging beside Adrian's, and below them, as the years accumulated, 3 smaller portraits, their children, 2 daughters and a son, who bore his father's serious demeanour and his mother's gentle heart. On this particular autumn morning, one that echoed in season and quality, that day long ago, when Isabella had first arrived at Wharncliffe as a reluctant bride, she stood in the pavilion where so much had begun, her hair now touched with silver at the temples, her face bearing the lines that came from years of laughter and occasional sorrow. And she was not alone, for Adrian stood beside her as he so often did, his own hair entirely grey now, his face more weathered, but somehow softer than it had been when they first met, as though happiness had worn away the sharp edges that duty and loneliness had carved. Their oldest daughter was to be married in the spring, a match made not from necessity but from genuine affection, and Isabella had been thinking all morning about how different Elizabeth's experience would be from her own, how her daughter would go to her husband knowing herself loved and valued, carrying with her the confidence that came from having been truly seen throughout her life, and she felt grateful beyond measure that she and Adrian had managed to break the cycle of loneliness and isolation that had marked both their childhoods. "I was thinking," she said to Adrian, as they stood looking out over gardens touched with the gold of autumn, About that first day, when I arrived here, feeling so lost and invisible, convinced that my life was over before it had properly begun. Adrian slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture so natural and habitual that neither of them consciously registered it, and he said, "I remember, I stood at my study window watching your carriage arrive, terrified that you would hate me, that you would see through my careful planning to the desperate longing beneath it, and I almost, in that last moment, almost sent word that the marriage should be called off, that I could not go through with taking what I had not earned. But you did go through with it," Isabella said, "and I am grateful, even though I could not see it then, even though I railed against the circumstances that brought me here, because you gave me not just a home but a purpose, not just security but partnership, and you taught me that being seen, truly seen, is perhaps the greatest gift one person can give another." Adrian turned her in his arms so they faced each other, and he said, "You taught me the same. You taught me that the love I had carried for so long, built on observation and imagination, could become something real and solid and sustaining, and you gave me the courage to emerge from behind the walls I had built, to risk being known, and in return, you gave me the gift of yourself, fully and without reservation." They kissed, not with the hesitant tenderness of new lovers, but with the comfortable passion of two people who knew each other completely and loved what they knew. And when they drew apart, Isabella smiled and said, "Shall we walk back to the house? I believe cook mentioned something about preparing your favourite for dinner, and I know you will want to review the plans for Elizabeth's wedding breakfast one more time, even though I have told you repeatedly that everything is well in hand." Adrian laughed and offered her his arm, and together they walked the paths they had walked countless times before, through gardens they had created together, toward a house they had transformed from mausoleum to home. And as they walked, Isabella reflected on how strange and wonderful it was that what had begun as a transaction born of desperation and secret longing had become the truest, deepest love either of them had ever known. That invisibility had given way to recognition, that loneliness had transformed into partnership, and that a marriage arranged without her consent had become the greatest blessing of her life. That evening, after dinner had been consumed, and their children had retired to their own pursuits, Adrian and Isabella sat together in the library, she with a book in her lap, though she was not reading it, he with estate accounts he was pretending to review, and the comfortable silence that surrounded them was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional turning of a page. And Isabella thought about all the evenings they had spent just like this, thousands of them now, accumulated over a decade of marriage, and how each one had been a small stitch in the fabric of their life together, individually insignificant, but collectively creating something beautiful and strong and lasting. Adrian looked up from his papers and caught her watching him, and he smiled and said, "What are you thinking about with such intensity, my love?" Isabella closed her book and set it aside, then rose and crossed to his chair, settling herself on the arm so she could look down at his upturned face, and she said, "I was thinking about how you told me once that you had loved me since childhood, since you were barely more than a boy, and how impossible that seemed to me then, how I could not fathom being loved by someone I did not even remember meeting. And yet now I understand, because I look at our children and I see them storing up their own memories and observations, forming attachments and loyalties that will shape them for years to come. And I realize that love is not always instantaneous. Sometimes it is built slowly, carefully, from 1,000 small moments of seeing and being seen." Adrian reached up and drew her down into his lap, settling her comfortably against his chest, where she could hear the steady beating of his heart, and he said, "I think there are many ways to love, Isabella, many paths that lead to the same destination. Some people are struck like lightning, immediate and undeniable, while others grow together slowly, like trees whose roots gradually intertwine until they cannot be separated without destroying both. And I think what we have is perhaps a combination, for I loved you at first sight even though you did not know I existed, and you learned to love me slowly, deliberately, choosing me every day until one day the choice became as natural as breathing. That is beautifully said, Isabella murmured, and entirely accurate. I did choose you. Every day I chose to see you more clearly, to understand you more deeply, to trust you more completely, until I woke one morning and realized that my life without you had become unimaginable, that you had somehow become essential to my happiness in a way that had nothing to do with duty or gratitude, but everything to do with genuine affection and partnership. They remained thus for some time, wrapped in each other's arms and in the peace that came from knowing themselves fully known and fully loved, and eventually Isabella stirred and said, "We should retire. It grows late, and tomorrow we'll be busy with the children and the wedding preparations and all the thousand small demands of life." Adrian helped her to her feet but did not release her hand, instead leading her toward the door and up the stairs toward the chambers they had shared for 10 years now, the separate apartments of those early days long since abandoned in favor of a shared space that had become their sanctuary, their retreat from the world, the place where Duke and Duchess could simply be Adrian and Isabella, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something rare and precious from unpromising beginnings. As they prepared for bed, moving around each other with the comfortable choreography of long habit, Isabella caught sight of herself in the looking-glass and paused, studying her reflection with critical eyes, noting the lines and silver hair, the ways in which time had marked her, and she felt a moment of uncertainty, wondering if Adrian saw these changes, if he found her less attractive than the young woman he had married. As though reading her thoughts, Adrian came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, and he met her eyes in the mirror and said, "You are more beautiful to me now than you were the day we married, because every line in your face tells a story we lived together. Every silver hair represents a year of partnership and love, and when I look at you, I do not see a woman aging, but rather a woman becoming more fully herself, more confident, more radiant with the knowledge that she is seen and valued and cherished." Isabella leaned back against him, her eyes filling with tears that were equal parts gratitude and love, and she whispered, "How do you always know exactly what I need to hear? How are you so perfectly attuned to my doubts and insecurities?" "Because," Adrian said, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head, "I have spent more than 20 years studying you, learning to read your expressions and your silences, attending to you with the focus and devotion that most men reserve for their ambitions or their hobbies. You are my life's work, Isabella, my greatest study, and I have dedicated myself to understanding you so completely that I can anticipate your needs before you fully recognize them yourself." They moved to the bed, slipping beneath covers that still smelled faintly of the lavender. Isabella grew in the gardens and had dried for their linens, and, as they settled into their customary positions, Isabella's head on Adrian's shoulder, his arm around her waist, their legs tangled together in comfortable intimacy, Isabella said, "I am grateful every day that my father's desperation brought me here, that circumstances conspired to place me in your path, even though at the time it felt like the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Now I recognize it as the greatest blessing, the pivot point that transformed my entire life." Adrian was quiet for a moment, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back, and then he said, "I cannot quite bring myself to be grateful for your father's failures, for they caused you pain and uncertainty, but I am grateful for the result, for having been given the opportunity to know you and love you, to build this life with you, and if I could go back and do it differently, if I could court you properly and honorably without taking advantage of your circumstances, I would. But I cannot regret the outcome, cannot wish away what we have built simply because the foundation was laid in less than ideal circumstances." Isabella pressed a kiss to his chest, directly over his heart, and murmured, "The foundation was laid in desperation and secret longing. Yes, but we built everything else ourselves, stone by stone, choice by choice, day by day, and what stands now is ours. created not by circumstance but by will and love, and the determination to see each other truly and value what we saw. Sleep came slowly, as it often did now that they were older, but neither of them minded the wakeful hours spent wrapped in each other's arms, talking or simply being together in comfortable silence, for they had learned that these quiet moments were just as precious as the more dramatic ones, that love was sustained not by grand gestures, but by the simple act of showing up day after day, year after year, choosing each other when it was easy and when it was difficult, in joy and in sorrow, in health and in sickness, exactly as they had promised on that wedding day that now seemed both a lifetime ago and just yesterday. When morning came, it brought with it all the demands and delights of a house full of life. Children seeking breakfast and attention, servants with questions that required answers, letters to be read and responded to, and throughout it all, Adrian and Isabella moved in tandem, supporting each other without conscious thought. A team so well practiced that they could communicate with a glance or a touch, and watching them together, no one would ever guess that their marriage had begun with coldness and distance, that they had been strangers bound by circumstance rather than affection, for what they had become was so clearly a matched pair, two halves of a whole that functioned best when together. As the day drew to a close, and the children had been settled for the night, Isabella stood once more at her favourite window, the one that overlooked the gardens and the lake, and she watched the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, and she thought about the girl who had stood at this same window 10 years before, terrified and alone, convinced that her life was over, and she wished she could reach back through time and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that the cold stranger who had purchased her father's debts would become the great love of her life, that invisibility would give way to recognition, that loneliness would transform into the deepest partnership she had ever known.